Hello, everyone. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you here today for the annual Feld Memorial Lecture at the Clow Library, one of the highlights of the library's calendar. The Clow Library houses one of the great Judaica collections, not only in this country, but on the planet. Its hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts represent, paraphrasing Matthew Arnold, the best which has been thought and said in the Jewish world, a taste of which we will get as we turn to this evening's event. It is, of course, with our extremely grateful appreciation that we extend our fulsome thanks to the Feld family for making this evening possible. Their love of books and their dedication to the dissemination of knowledge, which this library enables and which their generosity encourages, continue to inspire. Our thanks is inadequate, but it will always be sincerely felt. I would also like to thank our partner, the Meyerson JCC of Cincinnati, and to acknowledge their generous contribution to this evening's event and, moreover, everything they do, both to care for and to edify Cincinnati's vibrant Jewish community. I must also extend our sincerest thanks to Abigail Bacon, the library's head of public services, for her tireless efforts on behalf of the library and its patrons. We all benefit from her spirited dedication to making this library what it continues to be, one of the finest Judaica libraries in the world. As the French would say, revenons à nos moutons. I can say in all sincerity that it is not only my pleasure, but also my especial honor to introduce this evening's Feld Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Robert Adler Peckerar. While a thumbnail account may describe him quite accurately as a cultural historian and translator dedicated to sharing the complex richness of Yiddish literature and East European Jewish culture, Robbie's energy, erudition, and insight render such a description wholly inadequate. Robbie and I share a doctoral alma mater, the University of California at Berkeley, and Robbie's dissertation, The Allure of Germanness in Modern Ashkenazi Literature from 1833 to 1933, offers a remarkable reconfiguration of Jewish comparative literatures. And I will add that from all of Robbie's subsequent work, great subsequent work, I and so many others have learned immensely from him. Since Berkeley, he has been involved in a varied set of activities. He has been professor of Jewish literature and culture at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He directed Yiddishkeit, a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles, devoted to Yiddish culture and cultural heritage, as well as its path-breaking Helix program. He is now the executive director of the new Lehrhaus in Berkeley, California. In addition to his remarkable scholarship and his cultural activism, he is an acclaimed translator from Yiddish. His translation of Moyshe Kulbak's long poem of interwar Berlin, Childe Harold of Disna, the first complete English translation, is a landmark achievement. More recently, he has translated Itzik Manger's The Book of Paradise, one of the great comic novels of the Yiddish language. Robert Alter noted the book as being a high-spirited amalgam of whimsy, fantasy, and satire, all of it anchored in a rich sense of folklore, belief system, and social behavior of Eastern European Jewry before modernity. The overlap between that novel and Robbie's expertise made him the ideal translator. And finally, his most recent work is a tour de force translation of the 13 canonical tales of Nachman of Bratzlav, entitled Podolian Nights. All of these works highlight Robbie's intimate relationship with the intricate personal cartography and historical landscapes of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. So as I welcome Dr. Adler Peckerar, I invite you now to enjoy what promises to be the illuminating experience of the wild within, exploring landscape and memory in Jewish literature.
Well, thanks, Jordan, very much. And thanks, HUC and to the JCC for hosting this event. And I also just want to call attention to the fact that that recent tour de force book is a co-translation of the Podolian Nights with me and Jordan Finken, which I hope everybody and take a look at. To start tonight, I thought instead of doing a traditional lecture, I would do this more, since we're talking about landscapes and geography, more like a vacation slideshow of a number of historical and contemporary sites throughout Eastern and Central Europe, as we consider a little bit about the ways that how specific Eastern European landscapes shape and were shaped by the lives and literary imaginations of Yiddish writers, specifically of the three that I've most recently been working on translations of, that is Moyshe Kulbak, Itzik Manger, and Rabbi Nachman of Bratzlav. And we'll discuss a little bit of the ways that the works of these writers and the landscapes that they inhabit are revealed through these acts of translation, and also specifically think a little bit more about how these places these sites of Jewish literature become landscapes through memory, through story, through cultural experience, and take a little bit of a journey of discovery about these writers and the places they come from. So I thought I would start, just to set the mood a little bit, listening to a little bit of music for a moment.
Fin Kosev bis Kite is a bricale faranen, is a bricale faranen, wieder Baal Shem, spazieren is gegangen. Wieder Baal Shem, spazieren is gegangen. Fin Kosev bis Kite is a Wälderle verrangen, is a Wälderle verrangen, wieder Baal Shem, auf his Beude des is gegangen.
This song, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this song, perhaps. So this song is called Fun Kosev Biz Kotev, and the song is, which means from Kosev, which is now called Kosev today in Ukraine, and Kotev, which is today called Kuti, Ukraine, was a place where the Baal Shem Tov used to go and spend time. And that second verse says, Fun Kosev bis Kotev is a Veldele Faran, wieder Baal Shem af his Boidedes is gegangen, where the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, went for his Boidedes in Hebrew, so hit bodedut, where he went for spiritual meditation in nature. And this spot right here is actually the midway point between Kuti, Kotiv, and Kosev today in Ukraine. This picture was taken actually in October of 2021, just a few months before the recent war started. My last time there, going to do some hisboidedis, some spiritual meditation in this region. And one of the reasons I wanted to start here is because the idea of communing with nature, of the natural landscape, has long been a crucial part of Yiddish literature and of Yiddish culture, of Jewish culture in general, although sometimes we don't think about it as being as tied to nature as it historically was. And starting here with the Baal Shem Tov's connection to the specific landscape, it raises this question about how Jewish spaces, or any spaces, can be imbued with spiritual significance and legend. And one of the things that I often think about when I'm approaching places like this, and my work over the last 15 years has taken me, and I in turn have brought other scholars and artists to the historical landscapes of Eastern and Central Jewish life to explore these spaces and see what traces may remain, or what the traces continue to tell us, or maybe relate to us or relay to us about Jewish life in these places, even in the absence of a contemporary Jewish population. One of the things that I often think about when thinking about literature and space is that famously James Joyce has this famous note that he wrote in the margins of the book Ulysses, where he wrote, "Places remember events." And there's a lot of theoretical talk about what James Joyce is talking about when he jots this note in Ulysses, and it has spawned volumes of academic literature, which I don't necessarily recommend, about what does that mean when James Joyce is talking about places remembering events. Places remember events, he says. So what does that mean? People talk about, is this about Bergsonian ideas about memory that he's engaging with? Is it all about his interest in theosophy and cyclical nature of, but when we approach places and think about what they relate to us and just think about what they remember, it's a very evocative idea. I actually was struck with this idea here, actually, when walking around this campus with Jordan a little bit, about what it means for places to undergo such major shifts in what the purpose of a place is, how these places change over time, how places become emptied out and sometimes become ruined or take on new significances as we approach them, and to think about what are the events that these places themselves remember. I mean, we often think like, oh, if these walls could talk, but maybe it's a little bit more profound than that. What are the kind of whispers of memory that places can continue to imbue our imagination with and fill us with a sense of the past that can inspire imagination? And this is obviously when Joyce writes places remember events, it's a poetic thought, but I think it also pushes us to ask a question about how places can become so imbued with memory, with the history of the past, and what do these places themselves hold on to? And especially for Jewish culture of Eastern and Central Europe, what does it mean for us to consider these places when the people who inhabited those places are gone? What does it mean for us to approach landscapes which are also sites of immense loss, the sites of atrocity, the sites of ethnic cleansing? Can we feel the presence of a past on that landscape with the aid of Yiddish literature, or even just as a landscape itself? Is that something that we can sense or feel? And this goes beyond the sort of traditional Hasidic moment of hispoidedus, of spiritual meditation in nature, but it's about really hearkening to the sound or the feel of these places in the past. This is another quote that often comes to mind when we think about place, landscape, and its impact on us. Since there's a Zoom, I generally don't like to read the slide because I always feel like everyone can read the slide themselves. But this is a beautiful quote by Emerson that says, "All things are engaged in writing their history. The rolling rock leaves its scratches on the mountain, the river its channel in the soil." And then it goes down to talk about this self-registration is incessant, and the narrative is the print of the seal. I love this idea that the landscape itself is narrative. The landscape itself tells a story. And this question about that all things being engaged in its history, I think it beautifully articulates this idea of a landscape as a text that is constantly recording and revealing history. And the Joyce side of it is almost a flip side of that. What does it mean for us to think more about the story that comes from these places than the place itself? And I think that this idea of reading a landscape is something recently, in the last 20 years or so, that scholars and cultural theorists and cultural studies people are exploring far more. And we're not just thinking about geographical features like the ones described here about the movement of rock or of channels of water movement, but the stories the land tells, and then of course the meaning that we as readers and people who come and encounter the landscape inscribe upon it. And this I would say is a shift from thinking about ideas of geography, like the facts on a map, which when we think about Central and Eastern Europe, even to this day are continuously in flux. But what does it mean to approach something as a landscape, which is an experienced and meaningful place that tells a story, that has a narrative, that has an artistic form behind it? So a lot of my work over the past number of years has been exploring landscapes and bringing others with me to explore these landscapes from different fields, from fields of scholarship and the arts. And I have really spent a lot of time going through mostly Eastern and Central Europe and discovering sites that might just be mentioned by various authors or poets or just a note in their biography, and exploring these places and literally immersing myself and others in these spaces. This, for example, is a picture of Bokshe Osada. It is, or Ozer Bokshe, and it is a lake in the lake area of northeastern Poland, close to the Lithuanian border, near Punsk. And this place is the home, actually the original house of the poet Morris Rosenfeld, who maybe some of you are familiar with. He was known as the sweatshop poet, came from. And for those of us who work in Yiddish literature, we know Morris Rosenfeld really through the work of telling the stories of Jewish workers in the sweatshops of New York. His most famous sung poem, he also has a poem called The Sweatshop, which is obviously about the sweatshop. Mein Jingele, My Son, is one of his famous songs. And another poem that he wrote is called Mein Ruheplatz. That's probably his most famous poem, which says, Nit such mich wo die Myrten grünen, don't look for me where myrtles grow. You're not going to find me there. Wo Lebenswelken bei Maschinen, dorten ist mein Ruheplatz, he says. Where lives are withering by machines, that is my resting place. And this idea of the Ruheplatz, which also has a secondary subtle meaning of being a grave, is also literally a call to reflect on what is a peaceful space. And every time I studied Yiddish literature, we always thought about this longing for some sort of ideal of tranquility amongst the rush of the machinery that our American ancestors often, like my family who worked in the sweatshops of New York and worked in the garment industry, experienced. I never, until I came to Ozer Bokshe, to the Bokshe Lake, imagined that there was a memory of a most beautiful, tranquil space that is being reflected on in these poems, a place where actually myrtles grow, where things are really the greenery of this space, where the lily pads on the water are the most unbelievable tranquility in a space like this, in these glacial lakes of northeastern Poland, and to recognize that that's the memory that lies behind it, and that we don't have access to necessarily. I should also note that this is the first time I've ever done a talk less than 100 miles from where my own great-grandmother was born. My great-grandmother was born in Indianapolis. She was brought to Indianapolis from Russia by the Industrial Removal Board, which settled Jewish people in various places so that they didn't have to, so that other people didn't have to be bothered by their presence in New York. And my great-grandmother was born over 100, in 1898 in Indianapolis. And it's interesting to think about how these places, I have a memory, not even a memory, but an idea of what these places look like that is disconnected from the reality of these places. Coming here is actually an interesting moment for my own idea of I always joke that my ancestral homeland was Indianapolis, although I've never been there. But to think that the ancestral homeland of these writers has these beautiful spaces attached to them is something that it calls us to reflect on what we lose by losing touch with the natural landscape that underlies the writer's imagination. And one of the things that I've been trying to do in my work is think about how also translating in various different ways, in the very literal sense of resetting or moving people from place to place, bringing people from one location to another as another form of translation to bring people to have a deep engagement with places filtered through the writer's words. And so when I take writers and scholars and artists to frolic in a lake here, part of the experience is that resetting, to reset ourselves in the local landscape. And sometimes this can be very joyful. And other times we approach these in a different way. So one of the interesting things, and I think that there's a large collection of these here, I would imagine, of Yiskerbucher. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea. A Yiskerbuch, a memorial book, is a book that historically Landsmannschaften, which are societies of people who came from particular towns or regions in Eastern Europe who formed support societies, which often were mutual benefit societies that paid, you paid into it and it covered your insurance or your burial benefits and things like that. In the years following the Second World War, the Landsmannschaften often organized campaigns to create what were known as memorial books, Yiskerbucher, and produced full volumes documenting the full history of the towns that they came from, especially after the Nazi genocide, with often large necrological sections of this book, calling attention to those who had been murdered in the places where they came from, but also just a memory, just a book of memories of these places that called on people to remember, Yizkov, to remember these places. And this one I found to be especially compelling. This is the opening introductory paragraph of the Yiskerbuch from the town of Koydinov, which is now a town called Dzержinsk in Belarus, not too far from Minsk. And it is also the home of a great family of poets and writers, the Raisin family, Avram Raisin and Zalman Raisin, Sora Raisin, all come from this town. And this text actually, I believe, is written by Avram Raisin and the committee to create the Koydinov Yiskerbuch. And you can just read it yourself, but it starts here by saying, das jiddische Städtel is untergegangen. Von Zeit zu Zeit aber gefinden sich Jiden, was leben auf sehr Städtel in Buch, he says. The Jewish shtetl has perished, yet from time to time you'll find folks who have brought it back to life in a book. Like the place to the people in this Landsmannschaft feel that this space no longer even exists. The place only can exist in book form. And if you read through this paragraph, you'll see one very sad thing that they describe here is the idea that no one who they can imagine will ever see the shtetl as they knew it. They might never even see the shtetl again, certainly not as they knew it, where after the massacre and mass murder of the Jews who lived there. They'll never know what it was like, what shtetl tranquility lived inside them, he says. This book, published by the Landsman of Koydinov, brings the shtetl back to life, our town, which was annihilated. And then they close by saying, the majority of our children and our children's children will probably never even look at this memorial book, but the drive and desire to immortalize their shtetl in a book will never vanish. So not only, according to the authors of this Yiskerbuch, is the shtetl no longer accessible by, you can't travel there, you can't see what it once looked like, but also we have a linguistic block. Our children don't speak Yiddish, they say in the next part of this book. They can't even read this book that we wrote. We can only access it. This is only accessible to most people through my act of translating this book to people. And that's what occurs when I take people to Koydinov, like here. And this is a group of students that I took to Koydinov, and this is the old Cheder, the Jewish elementary school of Koydinov. And something happens, I think, when we go back to these places, go back in quotes to these places, and read that Yiskerbuch. And we read what it says. Our children's children will never know this place. They'll never read this book. And to read that book on the steps of the Koydinov Cheder, the Jewish elementary school, is a profound experience for many of the people who come on these programs. And it changes our view not only of Jewish life in this place, but it also changes our way of thinking about the past. So I would say that the act of remembering and documenting these lost places becomes a theme in Yiddish literature, but something different happens when we actually make physical contact or approach this from a landscape point of view rather than a solely literary point of view. One of the other things that I often do with these Yizker in my work is another form of translation. This is actually a hand-drawn Yizker that I've translated into English letters, but it is from the Yizker and I have written the names of the things that are on the map. That's another great thing the Yizker provide, they often have memory-drawn maps at the start of the book. Most of them not only do they say this is not to scale, but they often say this is drawn entirely from memory. So you'll often see like the things that are most important in their memory are far larger on the map than they are in real life. But the interesting thing about this map, which is a map of Smargon, which is the birthplace of the poet and writer Moyshe Kulbak, the things that are marked on this map, number one, the Great Synagogue. Number two, the Tarbut Shule, the Tarbut school. The Talmud Torah, the high school for Jewish children. And then other sites, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the post office. And all of these are indicated on the map. And one of the things that I like to do as another form of translation is by grabbing the map as it looks today and then superimposing the maps of Central Smargon for example, with the Yizker map and seeing how well the memory maps line up with the accurate. And this one is an especially impressive one because the streets line up still with the original places on the map. So you'll see here, if you can read, this is Kalka Gessel, and we got Minsker Gas. Oh, lost that there. And these places are still marked out on the streets. But when you go to access the spaces, of course, the spaces of Jewish life no longer exist, and we can only find them in the very smallest traces. Even this enormous Yiddish Beis HaKvoros, the Jewish cemetery, now is under a school. But when I took a group most recently on a trip to Smargon, we brought this map, and the head teacher at the school said, "You can't see anything, but if you come with me, let me show you something," and moved over a bush where she had one matzeva, a Jewish tombstone that had been preserved, that the schoolmasters had maintained and hidden behind a bush so that the memory of the space still was there, even though the entire cemetery had been paved. This one matzeva, this one stone still remained, and it was the barest trace of the unbelievably long history of Jews in this region, but only accessible because we had the map of this place. No one was talking about it. There were no signs pointing to the Great Jewish Cemetery, but only the Yizker showed us the map to these sites. Let me go ahead here. So one of the things that I often also am working with is the question about how do we experience things like the shtetl, the physical shtetl, which no longer exists at all in the way that it once did, but yet it continues to live on as a landscape of memory in Jewish literature, and how do we access that space in the material physical world? And I think that this is central to how in many literatures of dispersion and dislocation, questions of landscape show us how people can maintain a sense of identity by being able to point to a place of origin. And so one of the things that I like to think about in cultural studies, we talk about different identities in motion, how cultural identity isn't fixed, but it's continually reproduced through these sort of acts of remembering and storytelling about places. And that this idea of being rooted, of rootedness, the connection to original places often becomes idealized or narrativized. And these roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, the roots to these places, journeys and experiences, reshape identity and memory and reshape the way that the literature works. For example, and so I think that the idea of the shtetl, like Smargon, becomes one of these powerful root memories. And when I look at a place like Smargon with that kind of setting, and then look at the outskirts of Smargon, which this is a picture of the Vilia River on the very outskirts of Smargon, you can go to these places and think about how writers like Kulbak masterfully map out the physical and emotional landscapes of the places they come from. And I think Kulbak is a poet who I'm particularly attracted to because he does this so incredibly. The book that Jordan was talking about that I translated, he has a long poem called The Child Herald of Dizna. Dizna is the name of a small shtetl in Belarus. But in fact, throughout the book, he refers to himself as the child herald of many different Belarusian towns. And the book itself, when he reflects on the place where he comes from, even though he moves from Belarus to Berlin in the book in the 1920s, he maps a memory of a space that was a Jewish Belarusian landscape by thinking through all of these different places. And that's something that recurs in Kulbak's work quite a lot. Let me just skip ahead here a little bit. So this here is a photograph, contemporary photograph of workers, worker, I guess, right there, and you can see maybe on the back there on his horse, gathering hay. And I found this to be an especially incredible image because one of the great poems of Kulbak from his collection, his long poem called Reisen, which is a historical term for the region of Eastern Europe where non-Jews speak Belarusian. So there are all these distinctions of specific Jewish places, sometimes are linguistically denoted. Reisen is the place where non-Jewish people spoke Belarusian. That's the area where Kulbak comes from. And he has this great epic poem who the translation will come out soon. And there's also an online translation that I did, but I don't want to compete with Jordan's press, but there's another one online. And that I'll go to over here for a second. We can compare translations at another talk. But this is a poem from that volume called Hay Mowing, Mekoset Hay. And this poem says, over the fields, the autumn mist has begun to stray. Grandpa left at dawn for the marsh to mow the hay. At the raking, when day came, like jolly musicians' days, 18 they stood, grandfather first, and sang a psalm of praise, a step, a twist of the shoulders, a whistle, as if swamp lightning leapt. For a piece of bread, children, my grandfather spoke, one has to sweat, and the scythes whistled brightly. So one of the incredible things is just going to these places through the lens of Yiddish literature and catching sight of a rural farmer mowing hay and being able to just pick up a volume of Kulbak and see the way that this experience continues to resonate to the present day, even in the absence of any Jewish people still living in a town like Smargon. And this kind of everyday scene that clearly Kulbak had seen throughout his life continues to recur even in the absence of Jewish life there. Another great poem of Kulbak that's included in the same volume deals with mapping out the cartography, really this poetic cartography of the spaces where Kulbak is from. And this happens in the volume that I described in Child Herald, but it also happens throughout this long poem called Reisen. And this today is a photograph from, I think, 5 or 6, well, it's pre-pandemic, so whenever that's 6 years ago, of the confluence of the rivers, the Nieman River and the Velia River. And the confluence of these rivers today is in Kaunas, Lithuania. Kaunas in Yiddish and in Russian is Kovna, Lithuania today. And this is a picture of it today. And one of the most incredible things about approaching this place where you see the rivers come together is that it immediately, for those of us who know the literature, it evokes this beautiful short poem in Reisen called the Velia and the Nieman, where it says, when the moon spatters the earth like a silvery rain, a solid figure of a Lithuanian rises from the Nieman, and unheard from the Velia, a dark lady swims out to him. her hair tousled, wet, her lashes long and mossy, unveiling her smooth body from the waves. Then the Nyeman bends and embraces her and kisses her so green which gleam from sadness and takes her ashore to his blue crystal chambers. And this kind of deep engagement with the cartography it's beautiful, I think, on its own as poetry. And then when you see what's happening, there's a new thing that happens when reading this literature and I'm encountering these landscapes directly. And the ways that the poems are, of course, rooted in the local and tangible landscape and then become mythical and symbolically rich in the work of Kulbak. One of the incredible things that I found speaking to some of the older and still Yiddish speaking inhabitants of these spaces is their specific ability to remember poetry that is tied to the local landscape is an incredible thing. There's so few Yiddish speaking Jews left in these places. And when you talk to them about the literature and poetry they remember, it's often so directly linked to the local geography. I just wanted to show you a clip, partly because the person who I have in the next clip, she died last year, Fania Bransovsky, who was a partisan in Lithuania, in Vilna. She's from Vilna, actually born in Kovno, but grew up in Vilna. And when I asked her to remember any poem that she remembered by heart, she reflected on this one right here. So I'm just gonna, hopefully this will play.
Es bucht sich an jemand an jemand und nimmt sie und tut ihr Akusch in die Augen, die Grine, was leuchten von und nimmt sie auf den Grund in die blaue kristallene Salles.
The blaue kristallene Salles. So that's exactly the line that we had here a second ago, and takes her to his blue crystal chambers. She's able, generally, I mean, she had a little note with her, but she wanted us to know that the landscape and the memory of these places still exists through the literature itself. And so while Kulbak rooted his modernism in the landscape of today's Belarus and Lithuania, the poet Itzik Manger took a different approach. Manger is a great poet who is he was born in Chernovitz, today is called Chernivtsi, also in Ukraine today. And his family is from the region that we would call Galicia and Bukovina in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born in 1901 in Chernovitz. And one of the incredible things about him is also his concern with the local landscape. And one of the famous things that Itzik Manger does in his work is that he sacralizes the landscape of Eastern and Central Europe in all sorts of creative and interesting ways. He takes the actual landscape of these small towns like Stopchet and Kolomey, today Stopchet's a very small town, Kolomey is a larger town in Ukraine, and makes them into a whole mythology of Jewish experience. The book that I most recently translated by Manger, and this is part of his entire poetic work, I would say, looks at the landscape of Eastern Europe and thinks of it as mythologically sacred space. So he often resets biblical text or biblical text for the most part, and resets it in the landscape of Eastern and Central Europe. And the book of Paradise, one of the incredible things about it is that he imagines paradise, Gan Eden, as we would say, or he would say Gan Eden, in what is Gan Eden? What does paradise look like? Well, the Jewish paradise just looks like your run-of-the-mill shtetl. It looks like Kolomey. It looks like Stopchet. And in that way, he makes sacred these everyday places that he lived, his grandparents lived. I love this poem in particular because this right here comes from a poem that starts about, it's a question about he meets his grandparents on the way from the vision of his grandparents, his grandfather in particular, traveling between the town of Stopchet and Kolomey. The poem right before this in the volume says 7 miles from the Kolomey train station, you'll find the village of Stopchet. And when I first went to Ukraine many, many years ago, I was in Kolomea and I was asking people how to get to Stopchet, which is today called Stopchativ and has actually been incorporated into another town called Yabluniv. And no one knew how to direct me there. And so I told the driver, let's just turn this way and we'll drive 7 miles south of the train station like it says in the poem. And when we got out 7 miles down the road, I encountered this matseva, this tombstone, which I dated at one point. I mean, maybe someone can do it faster since we're in a rabbinical space, but it says Shnat Tatza, Taf Tzaddik Hey. Someone can look that up. I don't know my years so well, but it's old. But this ancient tombstone popped up as soon as I got 7 miles south of the station, and it was the Stopchet Cemetery. And you can see how he's engaged so deeply with the wind. He says, my grandfather is silent in this third stanza. The wind chatters from fields, mountains, and caves. My grandfather is old, the wind is young, and has a great deal to tell. I dream and listen. The moon is large, the roads bright as snow. Where are the horses? My grandfather runs between Stopchet and Kolomea. And one of the things that I love about tuning into the landscapes of this is the way that we can find these immediate links to the ancestors in these spaces and the ways they continue to echo their stories forward, as long as we have something to be our guide to these. And thinking about using Jewish literature, Yiddish literature in particular in these regions, as a kind of a Baedeker, a travel guide to these regions on their own, and to be able to encounter these spaces in this way. And one of the interesting things I think that we can think about is Manger's genius in general of the way that he makes the everyday Jewish landscape holy, and that he can take these spaces and kind of create this both a landscape of Eastern Europe that is on one hand mythological, but it also has the reciprocal effect of domesticating the ancient and sacred while also sacralizing the local landscape, and which has, I think, the incredible thing about Manger's work is how it can make this universal very particular, like these kinds of stories, but it also makes the particular universal. I just want to transition, because I'm getting low on time, to Nachman of Bratzlav, who is the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And one of the interesting spaces to travel to without going on one of these Hasidic pilgrimages of Eastern Europe, which is a whole different experience and not my field of expertise, is visiting places like this. And this is Okup in Yiddish, or Okopi today in Ukrainian, which means literally the ramparts. Historically, this town was called, of all things, the Ramparts of the Holy Trinity, which is the birthplace of the Baal Shem Tov. And the opening of the Shivchei Abesh, the stories in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, opens with a description of where the Zbruch River and its confluence of the Zbruch River and the Dniester, and that's right here. This is where the Zbruch River and the Dniester come together. And behind it is the Wallachian Plains, which is described in the very first paragraph of in praise of the Baal Shem Tov. And this itself is the birthplace of the Baal Shem Tov. And thinking of the Baal Shem Tov as a storyteller par excellence, who really wanted storytelling and the folk tale as being a crucial part of the Jewish experience, coming to these places and seeing these sites is an incredible thing. And interestingly, while the followers, many Hasidim, will go to the graves of Rebbeim, of Jewish Hasidic rabbis, or their ancient synagogues or shrines, there are no shrines like that here in places like Okopi. There's just this beautiful natural landscape and some ruins. I mean, one of the interesting things that I found on my most recent trip to Okopi was this, which is a sign that I took a picture of on this right near where it's believed that the Baal Shem Tov's home birthplace was. And the sign on this right here, on the little plaque, says, this fortress called the Ramparts of the Holy Trinity was built against the Turks by Stanislav Jablonowski, the grand hetman of the crown during the reign of King Jan III in 1692, just a few years before the Baal Shem Tov was born. The construction was supervised by Marcin Konski, the general of the Crown Artillery. And it was an amazing thing to just come across these places, especially in the former Soviet Union, where most of these historic sites no longer exist, also thinking about these as being the fronts of war and so much ruin. But these sites still remain, sites that were present in the very days of the Baal Shem Tov, is another way that we can think about how we establish a different type of spiritual roots of these places. Thinking about, when I'm at a place like this, I think it encourages us, when we come across these ancient sites that still stand in Eastern and Central Europe, to think again about the multiple layers of time and meaning in these places. Here we have a fortress that was built as a victory kind of monument against the Turks in the 17th century. And it tells us more about the life of the cultural life and the cultural history that gave rise to the Baal Shem Tov than simply just reading the stories themselves or his tales. Another space that I visited on this most recent trip was this space in Horodenko. And this is, I wish we could, maybe I can pause it, probably better. This maybe? Huh? I guess I cannot. But this is, for the brief moment that you can see it, is the great synagogue of Horodenko. And Horodenko, the Rebbe of Horodenko, Nachman of Horodenko, is Rabbi Nachman of Bratzlav's grandfather, who was one of the followers of a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. And that space, which I wish I could show you again, is today, it's not doing. Yeah, it's a sports hall. And we can see there's actually, very quickly we can see that there's a huge Soviet era mural on the wall that actually says, I wrote it down in case we had this problem, that says that physical culture and sport are the source of our vitality, health, and longevity. And that's written on the wall of the great synagogue of Horodenko. And I think one of the interesting things about going to these places is that if you ask anybody in Horodenko, there's no Jews there that I met, but if you ask anyone, where is the synagogue of Horodenko, where's the Wielkie Synagoga of Horodenko, they'll all tell you, oh, it's right here. It's the sports hall. And it's this interesting moment where I take people there and people are very angry or upset about this space being now a sports hall with kids learning judo, but it's still in use. And these spaces still have the resonance. You can actually still see in the wall, the Mizrach carved in the wall of this old synagogue where people turn, the mark where people turn to pray in this great synagogue of Horodenko, the great grandfather, the synagogue of the great grandfather of Nachman of Bratzlav. The other incredible thing about traveling to these landscapes, a lot of people, I think, like to read a lot of the writing about Nachman of Bratzlav. And this thing that Jordan and I, when we were working on our most recent translation, most of the work that's done on Nachman of Bratzlav is generally done from a Hasidic point of view, looking at the text as being a kind of not a roman à clé, but there's a way that the characters in the story, a princess represents the Shekhinah, which is strange if you read our book to think about the Shekhinah as a cross-dressing murderous pirate, but yet she is described that way in a lot of texts. And thinking about the setting, and one of the things when you come to a place like Kamenets-Podilsky, is to see how fairy tale-like the space itself is. The romantic kind of foggy old town of the ancient castle of Podolia here really allows us to access something about the imagination that gave birth to these kinds of tales, which when you read them truly are, I believe, a really incredible transformation of traditional fairy tales with a great deal of local influence from the, Podolia was an eyalet, a province of the Ottoman Empire for many years, thinking about this crossroads between Ottoman and Turkish life and Eastern Europe, and thinking about the impact of the Arabian Nights, the Thousand and One Nights, and tales from the East, mixed with the kind of grim fairy tales. You really see how the local landscape and the local geography gives rise to these types of works. So maybe I think I don't have time to do a little reading, but maybe. Okay, well, I wanted to just quickly give a sense a little bit of how Nachman of Bratzlav thinks about landscape in his work. Quite a lot, obviously, since he is considered to be one of the big proponents of this natural this meditative practice in a natural setting. He spends a lot of time reflecting on elements of the natural landscape. And I want to just read a little bit of one section of one of his most famous stories, which is called The Seven Beggars. And in this story, there's a lot of strange things that happen. But in this particular story, we meet a person who has declared himself to be a great genius of the world. And he explains his genius and how he came to be understood as such. And he says in the text, I'll just read a little bit in the Yiddish. He says, "Worin der emissarisch chesed ist sehr größer Mann. Und ich gehe und nehm zu auf alle emissari chesidim und ich bring sie zu dem emissarisch chesed und der Ikersban wird nur durch emissari chesidim. Daheine soll sein eine Zeit, worin die Zeit allein, daheine als es soll sein, Jahr und Tag auf der Welt. Das allein hat sich euch, Hashem Yisborach, beschaffen. Und ich gehe und nehme zum auf alle Emesse Chassidim und bringe sie zu dem Emessen Ish Chesed, was davon wird der Zman." He says, "The true man of mercy is a great man. And I," the beggar continued, "I go around gathering all true mercies to deliver to him. And these true mercies, they are the essence of time. From the moment time came into being, when days and years were created by our blessed God, time has been made of mercy. Thus I go around collecting these mercies to bring to the true man of mercy, and from these mercies time itself is woven. Now there is a mountain, and on this mountain is a rock. And from this rock flows a spring, and everything has a heart. The world too has a heart, and the heart of the world takes on the form of a whole being, complete with a face and arms and legs, and even the little toenail of this heart is heartier than any other heart. And the mountain with the spring stands on one end of the world, and the world's heart stands on the opposite end. The heart stands facing the spring, and the heart keeps longing and pining for the spring and cries out constantly in its desire to come to the spring. And the spring likewise does the same, longing for the heart. And the heart is doubly tormented. Firstly, it is tormented by the sun, which persistently pursues it and scorches it for longing and pining after the spring. And secondly, the heart can never cease this longing and pining, which continues with such an intensity that it cries out constantly to be allowed to come to the spring. And the spring has no time. It exists outside of time. Because it transcends time, the spring has no days. But how then can it be in the world, since nothing in the world exists without time? But the only time the spring has its wish granted to it by the heart is a single day as a gift. And were that day to fade and disappear, this spring would be left without time and it would pass away from the world. And if the spring were not to exist anymore, then the heart would, heaven forbid, also pass away. Thus also the world would, heaven forbid, come to naught. So as the end of every day draws near, the heart and the spring bid each other farewell. They share poems and paeans and fables with one another. the finest fables and poetry and songs with great love, with great yearning for one another, the heart for the spring, and the spring for the heart. And the true man of mercy oversees all of this with a watchful eye. And when the day draws to its end and begins to fade away, the spring would be left without its day and on the verge of passing away. And then the true man of mercy comes and grants another day to the heart, and the heart bestows the day to the spring. And then the spring has time once more. So you can see that in the writing of Nachman of Bratzlav, the poetry of the landscape itself is imbued with the natural beauty of the world itself, which itself is a reflection of the divine. Because in this panentheistic worldview, everything is imbued with the divine. And this idea of the longing of the spring for the mountain and the heart of the world, it inspires this type of writing, this way of looking at the natural world and hearing the ways that it tells us its own stories is a crucial part of understanding the work of Nachman of Bratzlav. Let me see, I've almost finished, but yeah, maybe I've lost my. So just to finish up, if I can find my last note, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the ways that these poets in particular, but not only, each in their own unique ways, use these specific landscapes of Eastern Europe not only as backdrops, but they are the vital active elements in constructing meaning and memory and identity. And they show us the way that we can produce kind of identity in relation to place. And it's this continuous dance of roots of one type with these roots of travel and another, and thinking about how these landscapes become the rich tapestries of experience. And by working in translation of these materials, it allows us to access these rich landscapes in new ways and to understand the way that these writers, and to understand these writers a little bit more deeply. And I know we began with me talking a little bit about James Joyce's idea that places remember events. I think that the works of these writers in particular, we can see how that kind of a poetic insight about places doing the remembering, it takes root in the physical world when we allow ourselves to come into contact with it. And that doesn't necessarily mean traveling to these places, but just accessing the physical world in that particular way through a kind of contemporary form of, he spoited this, of spiritual meditation in nature. And I think the way that Emerson gives us a lens to see landscape as a text of memoranda and signatures, these writers also teach us that. And in the wake of a century of atrocity, of the Nazi genocide, the profound erasure of the Jewish present, it makes our attempt to listen to these landscapes especially fraught, as we no longer have much of a living community to remember alongside that land. It forces us to strain, and every day with the passing of more people who are witnesses to that space, to strain even more difficultly to hear the events that these places remember. And I believe that what we recover when we read this literature, especially in translation, is a faint echo, but it can serve as a testament to what was lost, just as the landscape struggles to hold on to it now. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about traveling in these places, like I said, I wanted to give you a little slideshow. Hopefully it was more exciting than a general vacation slideshow. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the incredible things is how striking these landscapes continue to be, and how surprising they often are. I think that when we go to these places, for someone like me, who, as I mentioned, I have a great-grandparent born in Indianapolis, the old world, the old country, the Alterheim, is something that's very remote and always surprises me. You know, to me, when the old world is either Indianapolis or Brooklyn, going back to the places where my great-grandparents actually came from and seeing the beauty of their landscape was the thing that I think inspired me on the path of my work, seeing the natural beauty of these places, the tranquility, the peace of these places, what it must have been like to move from a place like near, not too far from Bokshe Lake to Brooklyn, you know, or I imagine actually that that rural Indianapolis in 1898 was probably also pretty rural. I don't know, but those are always surprising to me. And I think thinking about my own history as an American Jew who comes, you know, whose family worked in sweatshops and factory floors and experienced the rush of urban life. And I think of that as the Jewish experience. To go to these beautiful, tranquil landscapes and think, it makes me think about what my ancestors both experienced, but also why ideas like communing with nature are such crucial parts of particular Jewish traditions, like those of Nachman of Bratzlav. Yeah, so thank you. I think that the landscape itself is so striking that it tells its own story and shares its beauty like that. I do not. That is more of my old country. But no, I do not. Yes. The question was, how often do I go to Eastern Europe and will I take you with me? Well, I do run travel program. I should say, run annual or sometimes twice a year travel tours of Eastern and Central Europe. My last time, I don't know if everybody would want to go to Ukraine right now. It's not necessarily, and I spent a lot of time traveling in Ukraine and Belarus as the places I've traveled to the most, both of which are not the best places to travel to right now. So the last time I was actually there was October of 2021, just months before the Russian invasion. And that was the last time I was there. The last time I was in Belarus was just shortly before the famous election of Lukashenko recently that resulted in the revolution. And actually, for the most part, most of my contacts and friends and artists and guides who I work with in Belarus are no longer there in Belarus. Some are, but most of them have fled. So we're talking about a place that continues to be under a lot of flux all the time. I still do run programs to places like Romania and the Carpathians and things like that, other places of on the Baal Shem Tov route, which I know is surprising since I don't look exactly like your chassid. But I will be running those trips again in the future. So just stay in touch with me and I will be happy. Yes. Yes. Yeah, the Carpathian mountain range is a wide range of mountains. I would say that they range from, I mean, they descend into the Black Sea region and go all the way up to through the High Tatras, which are in Poland. So that's a wide stretch. So the Tatras are part of that chain of mountains. When we think about classic Carpathian mountains, I think we often think about especially Romania, the Romanian area, specifically Bukovina, as being as one of the great sites of Jewish life in the Carpathian Mountains, and then heading downwards towards through Romania, through Baku, and places like that. Yeah, so we're thinking about Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and that way into those would be the Tatras as they descend into the Carpathian. Yes, yes.
Say a little bit about what I would take to mention, the Bratzlav story, the religious allegory on the one hand, folktale. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. The question is about the tension between the religious allegorical aspects of Nachman of Bratzlav and the tradition of the folktale, maybe even more of a global tradition of the folktale and how it appears. I think that Jordan and I, while working on this work, decided pretty firmly on looking at this as being much more emerging from the traditions of classic folktales, and that the tradition of interpretation, especially of the kind of one-to-one correspondence making that future generations of Bratzlav or Hasidim like to do, was probably not the original what he was doing himself, Nachman of Bratzlav. It's also really important to think, and this I hope is something that when you all go home and buy our book, you'll take a look at. But there's this idea that the story, what we want, one of the aspects that we especially wanted to convey in our translation was the orality of the folktale, and the transition of that text from being an oral tale, when you read the actual tales as even as they're first published, that Nachman's amanuensis Nathan makes very clear all of these little moments that are all about orality in the text, that where he interrupts himself or he repeats himself. I mean, he really repeats himself. We wanted to actually maintain a lot of the repetition, lexical repetition. In fact, our editor at one point wrote to us something like, what did she was like, I recognize that this is a repetitive text, but this is too much, and then crossed it and made us remove it. There's something about the orality of it that really points at an experience that was happening in what I imagine to be the chata, like the hut, where Nachman and his Hasidim gathered and listened to a folktale. There are moments where Nosson clearly has stepped out for a break, and he comes back and he's like, I missed this part, and no one could remind me what was said, which is a great moment in the story. Or he'll be like, Nachman tired of the story and never ended it. And you're like, oh, okay. So there's that oral component of it that I think is crucial to the text. And then the later allegorical aspects, I'm certain that Nachman wanted one to meditate on those stories and find allegorical meaning in them, but more like a koan than you would need a guide, a key to. Now, when we read, even more recent translations like the Adin Steinsaltz's translation of that work, or in other translations, you'll actually find a key. Like there's actually, at one point, there's a chart that shows us like king equals God, princess equals Shechina. I can't remember, Chamberlain equals. Steinsaltz's translation is another Yiddish translation into English that was done by a team of translators. Adin Steinsaltz actually writes the commentary, but doesn't do the translating himself. He had a team of Yiddish translators. But I think that what we lose something about the original. I definitely believe that there is a real tension there that is intentional in that text. That we are meant to take those stories as works of pure imagination. And that is also what Nachman tells us to do. Nachman says, people say that a regular folktale is something that you use to put children to sleep, that you fall asleep to a tale. The aim of my story, he says, is to wake you up. And to me, that is so much more in line with the thinking of like a Zen koan than your traditional folktale. But I think that is still, that is a really important distinction. I'm hoping that is something that distinguishes what we were doing by making it much more of an oral text, by redirecting our gaze to things like that were popular, like the Arabian Nights, hugely popular work in Yiddish, and throughout the Jewish world, and of course throughout the former Ottoman Empire, and then of course into Russia and then into the West. We have no doubt that Nachman would have been familiar with the Arabian Nights.
If not,
yeah, or at least the Yiddish translation of the Arabian Nights, which I think leaves out some of the more salacious material. But yes, he would have been familiar with the idea of the Arabian Nights and with the types of stock figures, harems and kings and court intrigue and murderousness and piracy on the high seas. And things like that, we generally, I think it's amazing to think they would be, I think, they're magic rings, hidden treasure, all these kinds of things that we associate with that. And I think that, it's interesting to read the religious commentary on these, because I sometimes think that those are really amazingly imaginative texts, and being like, yes, the Shechina is a cross-dressing pirate who murders people in cold blood, but why? And then they have to kind of think about that, when more likely these are simply princesses who dress as men and murder everybody on the sea. Yes. This is Stari Kuti, which is Kitev. Yeah, Stari Kuti is, so yeah, it's a cool sign. So this right here is like I did a walk from Stary Kuti through the little Veldala, through the woods to Kosiv, so that you can still walk that little route. And this on this side is the sign when you get to Kuti, to Kotiv, Kitiv. Kitiv is this side, and that's Kosiv on that side. I really tried to find a little bridge and a little stream. I was hard pressed to do so, but yes, this is actually the site of Kitiv today. Oh, at the beginning, yeah. So yeah, that is really the picture at the beginning of this. Oh dear God. Yeah, we have to just go back all the way. But yeah, the clearing is the big field after you pass through there and enter the fields of Kitiv. And then it descends into this little region where famously the Baal Shem Tov gathered clay for bricks by the side of the river. In Ukraine today, yeah, in Western Ukraine. This area wasn't terribly bombed. It's not too far from Ivano-Frankivsk, which historically was a town called, it's in the west. It's close, I would say the closest largest city that was bombed is Ivano-Frankivsk, which historically for those who know more Jewish geography was Stanislavov or Stanisle in Yiddish. And that's the closest larger town to this region. But this is Kitiv right here. It's south and yeah, kind of close to, if you know Yaremche, it's in that region of Ukraine today. There actually is an interesting thing that happened recently in this region. They shot this new movie about a Ukrainian bandit named Dobbush, who was like a Robin Hood figure in Ukrainian folklore, not even folklore, he was a real figure. And there's a lot of stories about his friendship with the Baal Shem Tov. And in this new Ukrainian film, the Baal Shem Tov is in that and is played by a direct descendant of the Baal Shem Tov in the film itself. So this area is like people, you know, this really is this kind of heartland of Hasidic culture. Although again, there's no big signs about this. It's not like going to Uman or a place where you could, you know, do a big pilgrimage to these sites. But I'm hoping. So the question was about the relationship between like historically rooted ideas of in 19th century Romanticism. I think also you're talking about like the sort of tie to land and landscape and the work and the way that moves forward in today's kind of romantic nationalisms of today. One example is I think just thinking about that film, for example, which is obviously a film made in a time of very heightened Ukrainian nationalist spirit. About a Ukrainian folklorized figure like Dobbush the bandit. And it makes space for a certain contemporary type of multiculturalism, I would say, that allows for a very warm, pleasant relationship between Jews of this region and non-Jews of this region, which when we think 100 years ago, for example, or a little more than 100 years ago, is not a possibility. And when we think about what Ukrainian nationalism historically would have been in 1920, 21, for example, in the period of terrible anti-Jewish pogroms, for example, in Ukraine. But right now, I think the moment is an interesting moment in Ukrainian nationalism where there's and in other spaces too, I would say also in Belarus in particular, to a certain extent, I think also in Lithuania, where the newer contemporary 21st century nationalisms about these spaces envisions a multicultural past, which is accurate. Obviously, these were multicultural spaces, but there might have been more hostility or suspicion that defined the relationships between neighbors than this kind of new memory of these spaces, which sees a much more positive, has a much more positive gloss on the multicultural life of these of whether it's Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland to a certain extent. I think the writers who are engaging in this kind of work, Manger in particular, who is, I would say, doing an act of, I wouldn't necessarily call it a romanticizing of the landscape, as he is trying to do something slightly different. Manger is looking at the Jewish landscapes of Eastern and Central Europe and trying to understand a new way of doing what historically could be understood as midrash, where, or even, Jordan was just showing me some of the rare books today where you see a Haggadah and you see people dressed in medieval clothes, and they are hunting in the fields. And you can't really easily imagine that that was the biblical landscape. And that kind of resetting, I think writers like Manger in particular saw as being part of a Jewish literary tradition of domestication. That there's a domestication of text to the local, that the local and this continuous presentism, this idea that we live in the present, this is the present, this is where we live, it's not exactly a romantic idea. It's I think for someone like Manger, it's a continuation of a historical literary principle of understanding where we live now is all we have to imagine. I think that there are elements of Kulbak, I would say, that work in a sort of in more of the romantic mode about Belarusian national identity, and those are interesting too, because those are also, I would describe them as sort of marginal nationalisms. Like there's a kind of a sense of Jewish writers of these periods who see as very important a kind of solidarity with other marginalized nations, Jewish nation, Belarusians, and seeing themselves as all part of a space that operates outside of the imperial boundaries, and so it sort of forms a sort of resistance to these sort of imperial narratives in that particular way. I think, was that part of it, or? Sure. That's true. I mean, there are Jews who still, no, there are certainly Jews who said, she was pointing out that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is of Jewish origins. And absolutely, there's still, of course, Jewish people who are living in these spaces. I don't mean to say that these places have been totally emptied of their Jews, although for the most part, the spaces that I traveled to in the historic Shtetl of Eastern and Central Europe, which historically even had majority Jewish populations, generally do not have any or very, very few people of Jewish origins left in them today. Yeah. This one?
Well, thank you, Robbie. That was a tour de force, a tour de force. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think as this takes place in a library, I noticed, I noted down the moment when you said that, when talking about the Yizkor book, that a place at that point will only exist, or that only exists in book form, and that invites us to read spaces like texts. But that we have to do the reverse as well. We need to go out of the text and into the other text in order really to understand and to grapple and to come to terms with. And so I take your picture tour, my summer vacation essay as not only an edifying and really nourishing experience, but also, for lack of a better word, a provocation, like that we have to go and see, right? And so I really I thank you for that, and I thank you for this talk, and I thank you all for being here. There's more food, so go and eat, and please stay in touch for upcoming events. And thank you, and good evening.